Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Juan Fernandez wash processed Honduras from Solkatt Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Solkatt, based out of Kyoto, Japan. And this is their second ever appearance on this channel, having previously reviewed the Mario Moreno, a different wash processed Honduran coffee. And the backstory behind this coffee is a little funny, as when we had originally placed our order with Airworks, we had selected that Mario Moreno coffee as the one we wanted to pick up from them. However, we would end up getting that coffee as a gift from somebody else, so we decided to swap it out. And of the offerings that they did have, this was actually the one that I was the most interested in, which is kind of interesting given that it is a paraneima coffee, and I'm not the biggest fan of paraneima coffees in general, but the selection that they did have was pretty small, so it felt like a good opportunity to review a varietal that I haven't necessarily been the biggest fan of in the past. So it'll definitely be interesting to see how it turned out, as this right here is day 48. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a lower extraction one at a 15:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 90 degrees Celsius, which would be about 193 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which does indicate a more medium grind. However, we went a little bit more coarse on that grind as well. Now, roast profile for this one, once again, it is pretty much on par with a lot of Japanese-based coffee roasters that we've reviewed on this channel. Now, I did find Yoshihara to be a little bit lighter from that release that Airworks did have. That being said, this one actually felt a little bit lighter than the coffees that we did have from Weekenders as well. Even then, a lot of these coffees we continuously align with being on the more medium light side of things with a little bit more development to them, as this one I wouldn't necessarily say is close enough to being a true medium, but it is probably a little bit closer to that. So I could honestly see people saying that this one is on the more light side of a medium, or once again on the more developed side of that medium light by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 20, first impression through the V60, and the coffee was about as developed as I was expecting, as it definitely had a fair bit of roasty quality. So given that we did have that one previous experience with Solkatt, I kind of had a good idea of what to expect from the profile. That being said, it did offer a pretty sharp brightness that is on par with previous paraneima experiences. Pretty heavy bodied as well, with a darker profile and a slightly generic coffee feel to it. So by no means was it necessarily a great start, especially when you're giving coffee as a descriptor to it. I think it's probably just worth addressing what kind of happened with this coffee. I really didn't look at a lot of the notes that this one did have. I mentioned that Solkatt had a pretty limited selection of coffees that we could choose from, and I did want to supplement that Mario Moreno with a different coffee, so I didn't actually look at the notes. And then when I picked up this coffee and saw that it had a black licorice note on there, I was kind of skeptical as to how that was actually going to translate within this coffee, but given this first impression, it actually made a lot more sense, and that would continue from this point going forward, as on day 23 we opted for the Chemex. And there's still pretty similar sentiment this time around, as it's surprisingly bright for what this coffee is, while still offering a very interesting contrasting feel to it, given that it has those more developed qualities. Listed pineapple has also been in line with our previous experiences with paraneima coffees, and a little bit less of that darker profile this time around, but still notably abundant. So first two impressions, not necessarily the best. Let's go ahead and move on to day 26, as we opted for the UFO brewer, and reviewed the notes from the previous day, as it just seemed to mirror the exact sentiment that we had had. So I brewed the coffee with the UFO brewer. I took a sip and I said, what did we write for the previous day? And I looked at it because it was exactly what I was thinking for the coffee. Once again, it's both robust and bright, giving it a very contrasting feel. So I don't think I've ever experienced a coffee that was this notably contrasting, as it had a lot of those roasty qualities, but at the same time, it was just so unbelievably bright in a lot of weird ways. Darker sweetness in line with the listed licorice again, as the coffee does have a fair bit of bitterness in a couple of ways. So really haven't enjoyed these first three experiences, but from this point going forward, we're going to see what would happen if we lowered the extraction, as on day 29, we opted for the V60 with a 15:1 at 93 degrees Celsius recipe. And the coffee is still a bit off, as it has a slightly vegetal feel, with the background continuing to offer that strong, contrasting, uneven brightness to this one. So this also didn't necessarily seem to help. Listed licorice continues to feel apt, as there's a stronger, darker profile quality to this one once again. So really more struggles within this coffee. day 32 through the Chemex with the same adjustments. And the big takeaway is that the strong brightness is present yet again. And it's very unusual for a coffee with this sort of profile in terms of the darker sense to it, but also the roast profile of this one, because I'm still at a loss for how this coffee is turning out the way that it has as of this moment. A little bit bitterness with a lot of the licorice continuing to act against the overall experience of this coffee. So pretty stumped as of this moment, but we continue to work through it, as on day 35 we opted for the V60 with an even more coarse grind, and that definitely did seem to help mitigate some of the more heavy qualities to this one, as it's still focusing on the bitterness to the listed licorice, but also the contrasting citric brightness. And this coffee has been pretty, I want to say, two-note, given that those two things have just completely dominated the experience within this coffee. But I found progress, as that definitely did seem to help a little bit. So on day 38, we opted for the same adjustments with an even more coarse grind and 90 degrees Celsius. And this helped the coffee significantly, as it was by far the best it had been to this point. It definitely seemed to help mitigate a lot of those more bitter licorice-like characteristics, with a significantly greater focus on the traditional citric qualities to it. It also helped keep the brightness in a much more even sense, which also seemed to help. So I found that this coffee probably just needed to be significantly toned down, which is why we opted for the recipe that we did. Even when we went notably lower than we usually do with a coffee like this, I found that it was just a little too overbearing in those two specific ways. So on day 41, we opted for the Chemex with those same adjustments. And once again, the sentiment is pretty similar. So I jotted down a few more notes with this coffee because there was just better definition to the other characteristics. Some grapes, some plums, some red berries to go with that very traditional base of chocolate, brown sugar, and plenty of the pineapple-like brightness once again. A slight spiced sage quality to go with the very dark theme of this one, but even then, just found a little bit more depth to this coffee, as up to this moment, we had only seen two really defining characteristics to it. All right, so let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have 3 level 4s. Let's go through them. Cleanliness, level 4. I have to be very honest about that. It isn't reaching a level 4 any of the other days but the last one. The last day, those very significant adjustments definitely did seem to play a role in the way that the cleanliness of this one turned out. There are some days where I would be fine with it scoring as low as a 2, largely because of just how much darkness there is within this coffee and how much of a roastiness and uneven brightness there is to this coffee. But that goes to show that sometimes you can adjust a coffee to a point where you've significantly improved it, and the cleanliness was by far the biggest benefactor of the adjustments that we did make. Definitely notably more defined on the final day compared to all the other days that we did brew this coffee. Finish, level 4. And I mentioned that slight sage quality to it, but the other days, and I should probably focus a little bit more on the other days, just a little overbearing in a lot of bitter ways. So I mentioned that licorice quality, and I probably should have done a better job of vetting this coffee before purchasing it, but I just kind of wanted to see how a different paraneima coffee would turn out, and it's been pretty on par with my other experiences with paraneima coffees. But that and the brightness were the two very long-lasting characteristics within the finish of this one, and I could see it being even higher than that level 4, but towards the end we were able to tone that part of this coffee down, so level 4 where we opted to put that. Acidity, level 4. This one definitely offered a lot of bright characteristics, and I would say that even with it being as unusual as it was at the onset, I probably could have bumped the brightness all the way up to level 5, largely because of just how uneven it was. If anything, it reminded me a little bit of some overly processed Colombian coffees in the way that the brightness of this coffee was presenting itself. Very sharp in a lot of ways, so level 4 where we opted to put that, as I was happy to get that toned down within this coffee. Handful of level 3s. We will start with the sweetness, level 3. Not necessarily the sweetest coffee. I don't think I ever went into this one expecting it to be the sweetest coffee. Given that it was a paraneima coffee, given I had a good idea of what the profile of this coffee was going to be, I thought that it was probably going to be a little bit more medium in general. And I can say that towards the end, we were probably able to ramp that up, as on some of the earlier days, I would say that it was just so dark themed that I couldn't really justify it being higher than that level 2 mark, but that was another beneficiary of the adjustments we had made within this one. Berry fruit, level 3. I mentioned abundance of berry qualities towards the end. Grape, red berry is a lot of characteristics that are pretty common within Colombian coffees in general, all present in that slightly more dark sense of darker berry qualities. Citrus fruit, level 3. So, you know what's really funny looking at this tasting wheel? There's a lot of pineapple characteristics to this one, but it's just a lot of the brightness to it, the very uneven, unripened pineapple brightness, which is just so common from paraneima coffees that I've had in the past. But it's not like it's a very sweet pineapple or a very well-defined pineapple. It's just a lot of the bitter brightness to this one that seems to dominate it. So the citrus fruit, despite the fact that the brightness is higher than it is, it's scoring the level 3, which does make for a very interesting look within this tasting wheel. Chocolate level 3, definitely plenty of those more traditional Honduran qualities to this one, so level 3 where we opted to put that. Caramel also there at level 3, that's probably the majority of where I was getting the sweetness from this one towards the end. And then last thing worth discussing, body level 3. I'll briefly discuss the smokiness. It's probably a level 3 most other days. Towards the end we were able to get that toned down to level 2, but body level 3, yeah, even with it being the Chemex, this one definitely had plenty of body and texture to it. A little bit heavier in that sense, so don't necessarily have too much to add to that. As I am looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a interesting looking tasting wheel, but a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I still don't like paraneima coffees, and I don't know how many more paraneima coffees we're going to be reviewing, at least in the near future. Probably at some point in the distant future, as we usually go back to varietals that we haven't had in a while to try them out and see if maybe there's been some innovation or something's changed. But this one is no real exception to a lot of the other experiences I've had with paraneima coffees. That being said, I'm very happy with how we were able to get this coffee towards the end, as some of the early experiences of this coffee did lead me to believing that I was going to have a very difficult time getting through the entirety of this one, but it did feel like a challenge. And by the time that we got to the end of this one, it felt like we were rewarded for being persistent and continuing to work to try to improve this one, as there have been times in the past where I've given up on coffees largely because I didn't think we could get them to a point where they were enjoyable. I'm not saying that this is also another coffee that I would go back to and enjoy a lot in the future, but the final experience I had of this one was very fine. I would be okay if I went to a coffee shop and they served me something that was similar to that final experience that I had for this one. So that's to say, this one did turn out pretty okay by the end. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. Again, I continue to have to highlight the Japanese profile of these coffees, given that they do have that very notable and distinct developed quality to them. If you're able to look past that, or if that's a quality that you are looking for, then you can be rewarded with some other characteristics. It's very bright, it's got a lot of body to it, and it definitely has a little bit more cleanliness for a coffee like this, all while offering some nice darker themes to it in terms of that more traditional profile. Traditional berry scents, traditional chocolate scents, traditional caramel scents, all presented in a, we'll just say, slightly more intense and robust sense throughout. So that's kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Juan Fernandez wash processed Honduras from Solkatt Coffee. Thank you for watching.